Hi, my name is Joy Brown, and I'm here to talk to you about one of my favorite things to do, and that is to make quilts. Believe it or not, I never ever thought in my life that I would be able to make a quilt. My great-grandmother sewed, my grandmother sewed, my mother sewed, they made quilts, they made clothes. I was always dazzled by the things that they made. And some of their quilts I still have and still use. One day back in 2001, when I was teaching at Radnor Middle School, the teachers in the room across the hall asked me to help them with a project. They had received bags of donated fabric of some of the parents in Radnor, and they wanted to cut them all up and make it into kits so that the 8th graders could make quilts for people who were sad because of September 11th, 2001. I said, sure, I have time to do that. And so I took the bags home and I started ironing them and pressing them, ironing them. And I decided, okay, I can cut squares. They wanted squares. And so I could cut squares, and I put the squares together, fabrics that looked good together, and to 36 squares in every bag. It turned out that that was one of the best things I ever did, was to volunteer to help them with that project, because it got me started thinking, if an 8th grader can make a quilt, I guess I can make a quilt. What makes a quilt? A quilt has 4 different parts. So if somebody ever makes you a quilt and gives you a quilt, you'll know they must really, really like you, because it's hard to do all the parts. What makes a quilt different from a blanket? A quilt has to have 4 separate parts. You have a top, which could be plain or fancy. It has to have a middle, which is what helps it to be warm, and it has to have a back. Quilters call this a sandwich. Did you know you could have a quilt sandwich? Well, once you put these together with stitches, it has to be put together with stitches, then the 4th part is to make it all stay together. And that is binding. So after you sew it all together, you have to put on binding and finish it off, and that's what makes a quilt. The first quilts I made were plain quilts made with pretty fabric and simple squares. This is the kind of quilt that I would make and give to the guilds to give away to people in nursing homes or hospitals to give them a little bit of cheer. But it's simple, just blocks sewn together in a nice design. I moved on to slightly more complicated quilts. This is the kind of small quilt that I would make and give to my grandchildren or my nieces and nephews. This one will probably be little Paxton's first quilt from Grandma. When I got bored with just simple squares, I tried to figure out something more complicated, but that wouldn't be more complicated to sew. So I sewed things together in straight lines, and then I cut them out like puzzle pieces and put them together in interesting ways. So if you looked at this closely, you'd see that there are blocks, but they're all made out of puzzle pieces. And that was more interesting to do for me. When I'd made enough quilts like this, I decided to branch out. I started going to quilt shows to see what other people were doing, and I joined a quilt guild called Valley Forge Homestead Quilters. And I went to a workshop. And in a workshop with these ladies, I learned how to do something else. We followed a pattern, we chose our fabrics, and we all came out with the same idea, but they all looked different because everybody had chosen different fabric. The designer of these fabrics is one of my favorite because they're sort of wild and crazy fabrics. Well, I cut all these little squares, and I was up in Maine putting them together in making a pattern. My little grandson Teddy said, "Can I make a pattern with you?" And so the two of us made lots of blocks with 16 little squares in them. When you get all the blocks with the 16 little squares and you sew them together in your straight lines, you can get a really wild and crazy quilt. Another thing Teddy and I are doing together is making 9-patch blocks, because he picked blue. So I cut all kinds of blue squares, and I taught him how to make a 9-patch block so that the one in the center was different, and then you had 4 that were the same that went around, and then 4 more around the outside. So he lays them out, and then I sew them together. And when we're finished with all of these blocks, we can sew them into bigger blocks, and then we can sew the bigger blocks into a quilt. And so Teddy and I have had a lot of fun doing this, and it's a good way to show you that you don't have to do things that are difficult, and you can still come out with something good. The next stage in my quilting progress was to learn to follow patterns in a book. And if you follow patterns in a book, and you're careful with the directions, you can make more complicated blocks. But if you look at them, they're still all a combination of squares, little blocks that put together make a nice pattern. Another one would be like that. And all of these blocks came from that same book, and they were all blocks that were popular in the 1870s in the United States, 1860s, 1870s in the United States. And it was a lot of fun to make that quilt. This summer, Teddy and I put this one together. We spread it out on the porch, and he loved all the bright colors. The way that it worked, I started with a block, and then I cut it in half. And I sewed it to something else, and then I cut that in half, and then I sewed them together, so we ended up with a wild and crazy quilt. So what kind of a lesson do I have for you in this? 1, I want you never to be afraid to try something new. You just might find out it's the favorite thing you ever do. 2, when somebody asks for help, say yes. 3, when you have the opportunity to share something that you like to do with other people and make them feel happy too, make sure you do it. I hope you all have wonderful things that you can do, be excited about, and try in your lives. God bless.